So this video, it's going to be like solving a puzzle. The puzzle we're solving is, which quadrant is it? So note that x and y have different signs in the various quadrants. Thus, the trig functions will have different signs for the quadrants. Right, so the angles in different quadrants. So I'm also going to add the degrees here as well. Right, so if we have an angle that is between 0 and 90 degrees or 0 and pi halves degrees, that angle the terminal side of the angle lies in the first quadrant. If we have an angle that measures between 90 and 180 degrees, or in radians, pi halves and pi, that angle, the terminal side of that angle lies in the second quadrant. If we have an angle that measures between 180 degrees and 270 degrees, or in radians, pi and 3 pi halves, that angle lies in the third quadrant. And if we have an angle that measures between 270 degrees and 360 degrees, or in radians, 3 pi halves to 2 pi, that angle lies in the fourth quadrant. And of course, then we also have our quad angles, right? So we have along the x-axis is 0 or 360 degrees, or in radians, 0 or 2 pi. On the positive y-axis, that'd be a quarter turn, is 90 degrees, or in radians, pi halves. If we have half a turn, that's 100. Along the negative x-axis is 180 degrees, or pi in radians. Right? If we have 3/4 of a turn, right, which is along the negative y-axis, that would be 270 degrees, or 3 pi halves. And if we go in complete circle, that's 360 or 2 pi. Right, so there's our various quadrants for the different angles. And we know that different angles, different trig functions, are going to have different signs, right, based on what sides those trig functions use. So angles in different quadrants. If your angle is in the first quadrant, all 6 trig functions are positive, because x is the adjacent side, and that's positive, y is the opposite side, and that's positive, and the hypotenuse is always positive. So you've got all positive measurements, all 6 are positive. If the angle has the terminal side in the the second quadrant, the adjacent side is negative, the opposite side is positive, so anything that uses the adjacent side is going to be negative. Anything that that does not use the adjacent side is going to be positive. So sine and cosecant are positive in quadrant 2 because they use the opposite side and the hypotenuse, which are both positive in quadrant 2. In the third quadrant, tangent and cotangent are positive in quadrant 3. The adjacent side is negative, the opposite side is negative. So anything that uses just the opposite or just the adjacent side will be negative. The 2 functions that use both the opposite and adjacent will be positive. And in the fourth quadrant, the adjacent side is positive, the opposite side is negative. Any trig function that uses the opposite side will be negative. The 2 that do not use the opposite side are cosine and secant, so they will be positive in the fourth quadrant. So a little mnemonic device to help you remember, all 6 trig functions are positive in the first quadrant, so we can call that all. Sine and cosecant are positive in the second quadrant. Sine starts with S, and so does students. In the third quadrant, tangent and cotangent are positive. Tangent starts with T, and so does take. And in the fourth quadrant, cosine and secant are positive. Cosine starts with C. Calculus starts with C. So if you ever forget, just remember all students take calculus to figure out which trig functions are positive in each of the quadrants. So first quadrant, all are positive. Second quadrant, sine and cosecant are positive. Third quadrant, tangent and cotangent are positive. And in the fourth quadrant, cosine and secant are positive. So now we're going to use that information to help us figure out which quadrant would theta lie. So we have two pieces of information. All right? We have some information about two different functions, and we're going to figure out where they overlap. So as a little reminder, I put that same table we had on the other page, just a little bit abbreviated, telling us which values were positive and negative in the four quadrants. So first quadrant, got everything positive. In the second quadrant, the adjacent is negative, opposite and hypotenuse are positive. Third quadrant, the adjacent and opposite are negative. Hypotenuse, of course, is always positive. And in the fourth quadrant, the opposite is negative. The adjacent and hypotenuse are positive. So remember, adjacent is x, opposite is y, right? And then r is just the distance, right, from the origin to where your point is. All right, so we want to figure out which quadrant would theta lie. And by the way, I want you to put this in your notes. I didn't include this in your notes. This is sort of brandy new. All you need to do is write down what you see. All right? So if you had a note template, you would just have the names, the 5 pieces of information. You'd be writing everything else as well. Anyway, so it's just a little extra to write. Right? So problem number 1, we are given that sine theta is positive and cosine theta is negative. We're going to make a Venn diagram. The overlap is our answer. So we're going to figure out what's true for each of the quadrants separately, and then we're going to figure out which ones where it overlaps. All right, so where is sine theta positive? All right, so sine theta is positive. Remember, sine uses the opposite and the hypotenuse. Hypotenuse is always positive. So long as the opposite is positive, sine is positive. So opposite is positive in the first quadrant. The opposite is positive in the second quadrant. All right, so now let's look at cosine. We want cosine theta to be negative. Right, so cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. Hypotenuse is always positive, so the hypotenuse can't make cosine negative. Cosine is only going to be negative where the adjacent is negative. Where's the adjacent negative? It's negative in the second quadrant. The adjacent is also negative in the third quadrant. Right? And I'm just using the table right here. Right? And you might want to put that right next to this, because this will be very helpful, right, as you're solving problems as well. Now I look at my quadrants for each of the 2 pieces of information, the one for sine theta greater than 0 and the one for cosine theta greater than 0. Right? So this one is for sine and this one was for cosine. And I see they overlap. What's the overlap? Well, they both have quadrant 2 in common. Right? So that means that sine theta is greater than 0 and cosine theta is less than 0 in quadrant 2. That's our answer. Right? So for each one of these, we're going to find the answers for part 1, we're going to find the answer for part 2, and then our final answer is whatever they have in common. It's easy enough, right? Let's look at the next one. All right, so sine theta is greater than 0. All right, so where is sine theta? Sine theta greater than 0. Isn't that a lovely circle? That's where my glitch is. All right, excuse me, where is sine theta less than 0? I think I may have said greater. I'm not 100% sure, but sine theta less than 0. All right, so sine theta is going to be less than 0 where the opposite is negative. Right, so obviously that's not the first quadrant because remember sine is opposite over hypotenuse, and hypotenuse is always positive. The opposite is negative in the third quadrant. The opposite is negative in the fourth quadrant. It's where y is negative. Oh, man. That glitchy there. Ugh. All right, so now let's figure out where cosine is positive. All right, so cosine is positive wherever the adjacent is positive, because the hypotenuse is always positive. So that would be the first quadrant. All right, and notice we're also adjacent is also positive in the fourth quadrant. And if you're not sure, just go back and look at our table that's right there. So if I say, oh, something's positive in this quadrant or that quadrant, you can just double check by looking at my little helpful hint up there in the corner, our little coordinate plane. All right, so where do they overlap? Oops. Hey, something's missing. There is no fifth quadrant. Fourth quadrant, where do they overlap? Why, they overlap in the fourth quadrant. So that means that sine theta is less than 0 and cosine theta is greater than 0 in quadrant 4. And that's our answer. All right, let's look at number 3. Tangent theta greater than 0. So tangent is opposite over adjacent. So either they both have to be positive or they both have to be negative. They're both positive in the first quadrant. They're both negative in the third quadrant. All right, let's look at the next part. And we want sine theta to be negative. All right, so that means that sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Hypotenuse is always positive, so we want the opposite side to be negative. Well, y is negative in the third quadrant, and y is negative in the fourth quadrant. What do they have in common? It's quadrant 3. So that means that tangent theta is greater than 0, sine theta is less than 0 in quadrant 3. That almost looks like quadrant 2. There we go. I can't write in the gray area. That's off the board. All right, let's look at number 4. We're just zooming right through these. All right, so sine theta greater than 0, tangent theta less than 0. So if you just try to figure it out in your head, you might make a mistake. But if you just take a second and figure out each part, it makes this problem so easy. Where is sine theta positive? Right? It's in the first quadrant where they're all positive, and in the second quadrant, right? Because we know that sine and cosecant are positive in quadrant 2. All right, so now let's look at tangent. Where's tangent negative? So tangent's going to be negative, not in the first quadrant, right? That's where they're all positive. In the second quadrant, where the adjacent is negative, and in the fourth quadrant, where the opposite is negative. Right? Tangent is positive in the third quadrant. And what do they have in common? It's the second quadrant. Right? That's where the overlap is. So that means that sine theta is greater than 0, tangent theta is less than 0 in quadrant 2. And last but not least, yeah, right, in blue. Sine theta is less than 0, cosine theta is less than 0. All right, so where is sine theta less than 0? All right, it's going to be where the opposite is negative, right? So that's going to be the third quadrant and the fourth quadrant. Where is cosine negative? Let's make there we go, our circles overlap. All right, so cosine is negative wherever the adjacent is negative. That's the second quadrant and the third quadrant. Where do they overlap? the third quadrant. So sine theta is less than 0. Cosine theta is less than 0 in quadrant 3. That's where they overlap. And I believe that's my last one for this video. Yep, it's the last one. All right, so this one's a little bit of a quick video. All right, so this is just in what quadrant would theta lie? And it's as simple as identifying where each one is positive or negative and looking for where our two requirements overlap. All right, so thanks for watching and bye for now.